What is going on, Headliner Nation? The good news is we don't have to worry about too many buys this week, but the bad news is we've got some studs that are dealing with injuries right now that we really need to get healthy. And in today's video, we're going to be going through every single matchup on the schedule for week 7 to talk about wide receivers and try to figure out who should we be starting, who should we be sitting, and who's worth the risk of being in our lineup. But before I get into all that information, I gotta remind you that we got a huge giveaway going on right now. We're picking one person to win this beautiful, full-size framed, autographed Jonathan Taylor jersey. And for you to get entered into winning this, all you need to do is head on over to Underdog, download the app, create a new account using code word headliners while depositing at least $10. And after you play in your very first contest, you're going to be entered to win. It's as simple as that. But you're also going to get some special treatment just for using our code, because you're going to get a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit and that you can pair with the other pick'ems that I'll be talking about in today's episode. And on top of that, you're going to be getting a deposit bonus of up to $1,000. So if you've been missing out on all the action and all the fun over on Underdog, then right now is the perfect time to get started. And for Thursday Night Football this week, it's going to be Bo Nix and the Denver Broncos going up against Spencer Rattler and the New Orleans Saints. Tell me if you all had predicted that back at the beginning of the season. It has the makings of maybe one of the worst Thursday Night Football matchups of the entire year. Maybe I'll end up eating those words by the end of the week, but this just doesn't feel like a great matchup to me for fantasy purposes. The Denver Broncos offense feels like it either only succeeds in garbage time or they can't figure it out until the second half. It's outdated, bland play calling that Sean Payton shows that he hasn't evolved since his days in New Orleans, or maybe he was just carried by Drew Brees. The Saints are currently allowing the 5th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers, so there's a little bit of promise here, but Courtland Sutton is highly touchdown dependent. If he doesn't score a touchdown, he just doesn't make enough plays to be fantasy viable, and that's not all his fault. Bo Nix is the major culprit there, along with the game plan. Vel, to me, is going to be the safest option of all of these wide receivers for the Denver Broncos. In each of his 2 healthy games this season, he's led the team in targets. For New Orleans, they get to face a Denver defense that is allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position right now. But Patrick Surtain, who went out with a concussion in week 6, may not be ready for the short turnaround on Thursday Night Football. Now, Rashid Shaheed still saw 7 targets last week, which is good that Spencer Rattler was looking his way that often. But in this matchup, even without Patrick Surtain, this is a tough Denver defense, and he's going to be very volatile and very big play dependent. Bub Means is going to be the guy that we should be taking a look at, and I really did not have that on my bingo card. Bub Means? He saw 8 targets last week after Chris Olave went out. And Chris Olave is in the same situation as Patrick Surtain, not being able to turn around on a short weeks of rest to play on Thursday Night Football. So if Bub Means ends up playing and Chris Olave ends up missing, that's a whole lot of targets that could end up going his way because he's not going to be covered by the top cornerbacks. Jacksonville stayed overseas this week, and they'll be closing out the London series going up against New England. And Drake May looked fantastic last week, which is something you can't say about the Jacksonville defense so far this season. Drake May could end up tearing them apart, and Demario Douglas would be the person that benefits the most from that. Demario Douglas led the team with 9 targets last week and scored a touchdown, and he's going up against a Jacksonville defense that allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game and the 2nd most receiving yards to the wide receiver position. So his current projection of 45.5 yards over on Underdog doesn't even seem close to being high enough. So I'm absolutely going to go higher than that prediction right there, and you can lock that in with that special pick'em you got for signing up with Headliners. But especially in a PPR league this week, Demario Douglas could end up being a great addition to your lineup that has a super solid floor, but a whole lot of ceiling to go with it. I know Gabe Davis scored 2 touchdowns last week, but there's no way that I can go back to him. And Brian Thomas dropped a touchdown in the end zone. In this matchup this week, I'm only really taking a look at Brian Thomas Jr. and then Christian Kirk if you absolutely need somebody. Christian Kirk's going to need 5 to 6 targets to make any type of fantasy viable day available for your lineup. Brian Thomas Jr. has some big play potential in this matchup still, but with Evan Ingram being back and seeing so many targets last week, it does kind of affect how we're going to have to look at the wide receivers moving forward. Seattle and Atlanta feels like a matchup where these two teams could combine for like 100 passing attempts in this game. DK Metcalf actually may be one of the safer wide receivers that you can have in your lineup for fantasy football right now. He sees a ton of targets and the offense that runs the most plays per game in all of football. So this is benefiting him a lot. And his ceiling is come and go at times, but his floor has generally been there all season long. But you really can't say that for the other two wide receivers. And unfortunately, it would probably take an injury for one of these guys to find a lot of consistent fantasy value. For this team, though, Tyler Lockett to me is the wide receiver too. He's got more big playability than Jackson Smith-Njigba, and he just feels like he's being looked at way more often by Geno Smith in situations that allow for more fantasy potential. And while Jason has the ability to go off in any given week, unfortunately his floor is a whole lot lower than the other two. Seattle's defense doesn't feel as stout right now as it did at the beginning of the season, but they did bounce back against San Francisco. They had a couple of really rough weeks at stopping opposing offenses. And when you take a look at the wide receivers last week, outside of one big play by Deebo Samuel, the wide receivers really didn't get a whole lot against this Seahawks secondary. So we'll see if that transitions this week to the game plan for Atlanta. Atlanta 2 weeks ago looked absolutely unbeatable. And then last week, when they should have taken bigger advantage of things, they just didn't look nearly as sharp. Both of these guys for Drake London and Darnell Mooney have medium risk this week. They both have super decent floors in this matchup, but the ceiling is one thing that I will be cautious with. Last week, Will Levis and this Tennessee offense had a great matchup through the air against the Indianapolis Colts, and they still couldn't deliver. Just like I've talked about with Will Levis over the first few weeks, he makes way too many mistakes and he's not making great decisions in the pocket. And because of that, it's tanking the value of everyone around him except Tony Pollard. Now, Buffalo's going to have a new weapon in their offense this week with Amari Cooper joining the Bills, and that could really switch up a whole lot of things when it comes to the target share. If you have Amari Cooper, you're probably going to be looking to get him into your lineup. Just keep an eye throughout the week on the news on whether or not people think he's going to have a full workload or if he's going to be worked into the game plan slowly, and maybe over the next couple of weeks is when he takes off. If we hear anything like that, then maybe we do need to go ahead and sit him in our lineups this week, even if he's playing for Buffalo. But Khalil Shakir should still be a pretty decent option for those of you out there that need somebody with a safe floor, and Keon Coleman shouldn't even be in any of your lineups now. Joe Burrow needs to find a way to beat Cleveland this week. It absolutely needs to happen if Cincinnati wants to get this season back on track and have a shot at the playoffs. And for their wide receiver core, we know Jamar Chase is a must start every single week and will continue down that path every single week. But we shouldn't ignore the volume of T. Higgins, which makes him a low-risk start right now. Since returning from his injury in 4 games, he has 37 targets. Maybe he doesn't have the ceiling of Jamar Chase, but he absolutely has the same floor. Now, with Amari Cooper being gone from Cleveland, I think we're going to need to give it some time to see really who is the main beneficiary here. David Njoku seems like he's going to be that guy, and we'll discuss that in the tight end video that's already been posted. Make sure you check that out after this one. But for the wide receivers with Jerry Jeudy, Elijah Moore, and whoever else may happen along, it feels like it's going to end up being Jeudy. But this week in this matchup, I'd probably go ahead and just hold off on trying to start either of these guys until we can get a better feel for who Deshaun Watson is going to be looking at the most. This right now is the movie about how Tank Dell got his groove back, and unfortunately, it took an injury for Nico Collins to make that happen. Now, if you've been holding on to Tank Dell this entire time, take advantage of it over the next few weeks while Nico Collins is healing up. He had a team-high 9 targets last week. Him and Stefon Diggs both ended up finding the end zone. And for redraft purposes, things are not nearly as murky for the wide receivers right now. If you've got either of these guys, they've got safe floors, They've got good ceilings, and they both should be in your lineup. Jayden Reed, to me, is the only safe bet in this Green Bay offense right now. He led the team in targets once again last week. He keeps finding the end zone, and he's clearly the #1 wide receiver and target for Jordan Love. But when you take a look at a guy like Romeo Doubs, who had 2 touchdowns last week, that looks appealing, but he had 2 touchdowns on 4 targets. That's not sustainable. Christian Watson had a touchdown, but he only had 4 targets as well. If this is a negative game script, both of those guys definitely have a much better floor. But if this is a neutral game script, or if Green Bay ends up leading this game, Jayden Reed is really the only fantasy viable guy that I can rely on in my lineup. This should have been a massive game for both Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, but with Tyler Huntley as your quarterback, you don't have nearly the same type of ceiling. Now, their fantasy floor right now is like 4 to 6 fantasy points, and we know it only takes one play to make your fantasy days sometimes, but that's what these guys are going to be relying on. Indianapolis is allowing the 7th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. So I'm definitely on board if you need to start Tyreek Hill or Jalen Waddle this week, because the opportunity will be there. But this offense has been so bad since the Tua injury. You got to remind yourself that there's a lot of luck that's going to go in to either of these guys being dominant this week. Miami is currently allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And a whole lot of what we do with this depends on who starts at quarterback. Anthony Richardson was expected to be the starter last week towards the end of the week, and then all of a sudden, Joe Flacco became the starter instead, and Anthony Richardson was serving as like the emergency number 3. Well, if he was healthy enough to be the number 3, why was he not healthy enough to play? That's going to be a question that we'll need answered the rest of the week. It's going to be interesting to see if Indianapolis feels like their best chance at winning this season is with Joe Flacco. And if they think that, we could see him starting way more often, and Anthony Richardson is going to have to sit for another year and continue to work on the things that need to be cleaned up. If Joe Flacco is the starter, these guys have fantasy value. If Anthony Richardson is the starter, they are extremely risky. A huge matchup in the NFC North this week is the 4-1 Lions take on the 5-0 Minnesota Vikings at Minnesota. And both of these defenses are really the definition of bend but don't break. And they cause a lot of turnovers, but they give up a ton of yards as well. Minnesota is currently allowing the 3rd most fantasy points and the 4th most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers. And even if Jared Goff ends up having some troubles with turnovers here on the road, there's still plenty of opportunity for Jameson Williams and Amon-Ra St. Brown to not only have a solid floor, but a really nice ceiling to go along with it. And Detroit's defense right now, even with their bye, is allowing the 3rd most receiving yards to wide receivers. Now, it'll be interesting to see what this defense looks like with no Aiden Hutchinson. At the time of his injury, not only was he leading the league in sacks, but quarterback pressures as well. And when you have a guy that is consistently getting into the backfield like that, or at least causing so much trouble on the line that it's allowing others get to the backfield, that really hurts. It overshadows problems that you have in your secondary, especially when you have a lot of penalties. So we're going to see exactly what this Lions defense looks like. Justin Jefferson will definitely be a safe start for me, but Jordan Addison has some fantasy value as well. A.J. Brown owners rejoiced last week as he finally returned from his injury and had a big game to go along with it. This week against the New York Giants, he's definitely got a safe floor because he's the target guy. Jalen Hurts looks his way more often than anyone else, and there's no Dallas Goedert this week. Now, Devontae Smith still has a decently high ceiling because of his big play potential, but this is a game that could be absolutely dominated by Saquon Barkley. And if it is, it could end up hurting the ceiling just a little bit, especially with a lead. We are going to continue to monitor the progress of Malik Nabers throughout the rest of the week. It sounds like when I recorded this video that he was on track to return to practice as a non-contact participant, which is actually good. That means he's progressing throughout the concussion protocol. But it certainly doesn't mean that he's clear as of yet. It sounds like, based on everything I read, that the Giants expect that he will play this week, but the next couple of days will be big indicators because of that. If Malik Nabers plays, he's a low-risk start. He gets way too many targets to even be considered for the bench. You got to have him in your lineup. Wan'Dale Robinson carries a little bit more risk at that point because he may not see as many targets. However, if it's a negative game script, Wan'Dale Robinson will probably still be super solid. Now, if Malik Nabers ends up missing for any reason, then Wan'Dale Robinson becomes a low risk start because he's basically going to see all the targets. The wide receivers are kind of in a tough position for Las Vegas right now. Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew just aren't getting the job done. There's not a strong enough run game to help take the pressure off, and all the targets in this offense are going to Brock Bowers. So when you take a look at what will life be like after Davante Adams, Jakobi Meyers definitely has an opportunity to be a safer play in this offense just because he's going to be the number one wide receiver. However, Trey Tucker should also be considered as well. But there's going to be some unrealistic expectations at times. There's going to be some games where it's like, hey, this is a great matchup. We should really be all in on this one, kind of like this week against the LA Rams, where unfortunately it just doesn't end up working out. We need to keep an eye on Cooper Kupp this week. At some point, he's supposed to meet with a trainer to determine whether or not he can start ramping up his practice regimen again. And based on some reports I saw, he could actually play this week if doctors and trainers deem that he's ready to go. Now, I don't think we're going to see Cooper Kupp this week, but if we do for some reason, we're going to need to discuss that later on. With no Cooper Kupp, Tutu Atwell has been kind of the main guy or the most consistent guy among wide receivers, and because of that, we would go his route if for some reason Kupp doesn't end up playing. Deontay Johnson has been a wide receiver one 3 of the last 4 weeks, and in all of those wide receiver one performances, he saw double-digit targets, and that could happen once again going up against Washington. Not only should it be negative game script for Carolina, but it also should lead to some plays against their secondary that definitely allows quite a bit of opportunity. Now, Xavier Legette has some touchdown potential in this matchup, and his ceiling isn't all that bad, but it's the floor that definitely could be a little bit of an issue. If you're trying to start Xavier Legette, you're hoping for that big play or that touchdown. If he doesn't get either of those things, though, it can end up being quite an underwhelming fantasy day. Another week where I'm all in on the Jaden Daniels to Terry McLaurin connection. Now, we didn't see the big play from McLaurin last week, but we still saw 2 touchdowns. And this week, the only thing I'm worried about is their ceiling, because if they end up blowing out Carolina in the first half, there may not be a ton of volume for Terry McLaurin in the second. Let's really hope he gets his fantasy points early in the day. There's no way that in 2024, Juju Smith-Schuster is going to be the savior for our fantasy teams, right? I mean, big game last time out. Absolutely love to see that. And for those of you that grabbed him up off the waiver wire, he's going to be fantasy viable, it looks like, moving forward. Xavier Worthy's definitely going to have a high risk almost every single week. If he's not scoring that touchdown, he's just not getting enough volume right now. The big play potential is always going to be there, and they're utilizing him in some different ways to help him get into the end zone. But as far as volume goes, it's going to be Travis Kelce and then probably Juju after that. In this matchup, Deebo Samuel has to be a low-risk play. Jordan Mason is banged up and may not be able to go this week. We'll see as the week progresses, and if that happens, Deebo's going to be used all over the formation. And even if Jordan Mason ends up playing, they may be a little bit more cautious with him and still give Deebo some of those touches out of the backfield. Those all-purpose yards are exactly what we want from Deebo this week. Brandon Ayuk, though, is going to have a little bit of a tougher assignment with Trent McDuffie all over him. I know a lot of people are already really upset with Brandon Ayuk's performances here as of recent, but unfortunately this week it probably doesn't get any easier, and it leads me to believe that Jauan Jennings could actually end up seeing more targets than him. I would be willing to bet that Davante Adams is going to make his debut with the Jets on Sunday Night Football this week. The hamstring injury that he had with the Las Vegas Raiders, I'm probably going to say wasn't nearly as bad as what it was made out to be. And he'll be out there with Aaron Rodgers. And some of this Jets offensive game plan probably comes from what Nathaniel Hackett did with these guys back in Green Bay anyway. So I don't know if there's going to be this big, huge learning curve. Him and Aaron Rodgers already know each other. I'm definitely willing to run Davante Adams out there in week 1. Now, Garrett Wilson is going to be a medium risk for me because I still think he's going to see plenty of targets. I just don't think he's going to have the target share that he did the last couple of weeks. So he may be a little bit more big play and touchdown dependent, which is fine because he could end up doing both of those things with no issues whatsoever. We're just going to monitor the fact that he's going to be losing some targets, and that's why he drops from a low risk to a medium risk. I already didn't want a piece of this offense going up against the New York Jets this week. And then the Pittsburgh Steelers made the absurd decision to bench Justin Fields, who they've gone 4-2 with, and instead start Russell Wilson, who hasn't played in a game yet this season. Now I'm definitely off this offense, and I'm certainly going to list George Pickens as my Mando must-avoid wide receiver for the week. The New York Jets are already one of the best defenses in all the NFL. And now you're going to be starting a quarterback against them who hasn't had an opportunity to play in a live game yet for the regular season. There is no way that I am running George Pickens out there, and I'm going to leave him on my bench this week. Maybe he does see a big play. Maybe he does end up finding the end zone. Even though his ceiling isn't all that terrible, his floor is awful. The dude may only score a couple of fantasy points this week if Russell Wilson just can't get things going against the Jets. And I'm going to be avoiding George Pickens the same way I use Mando to avoid odor, with their clinically proven formula to help defeat odors for up to 72 hours. They are the perfect company for anybody that's got a busy schedule out there. And right now over on Shop Mando, you can use code word headliners for $5 off their starter pack. That's essentially 40% off the price. So go get your starter pack today, use our code, and start defeating odors. I feel like this could end up being like the Oprah of fantasy matchups. You get fantasy points. You get fantasy points. Everybody gets fantasy points. Zay Flowers should be in for another big day, going up against an opposing defense that allows a ton of yards to wide receivers, and an offense that should keep this at least in a neutral game script, which is great for Zay Flowers. If you want to try and run Rashad Bateman out there, you better hope for a couple of big plays though. Baltimore is allowing the most touchdowns, most fantasy points, and second most receiving yards to opposing wide receivers right now. Give me all the Mike Evans, give me all the Chris Godwin. 3 wide receivers in this matchup could potentially finish inside the top 12 this week. And let's just go ahead and take advantage of some very generous projections right now over on Underdog, because Zay Flowers' projection is 63.5 yards, and you best believe I'm going higher than that. Chris Godwin's is just a little bit higher at 69.5 receiving yards, but that's also a number that I'm going to go over on as well. Both of these projections seem way too low for me, and we should jump on it now before it raises the rest of the week. For the second Monday Night Football matchup this week, Ladd McConkey could end up being a really valuable starter for your fantasy team that may not have the most ceiling in the world, but definitely going to have a super safe floor in this favorable matchup. Now, behind him, it's really a mess because now Simi Fehoko is also working his way into the rotation of wide receivers. The only guy that's been consistent so far this year has been McConkey, so that's the guy I'll roll with. And for the Arizona Cardinals, Marvin Harrison Jr. is going to be a high-risk play right now. Number one, because he's still in the concussion protocol, and I don't know if he's going to clear, although having an extra day this week definitely would help. But even if he does clear, this is an extremely tough matchup against the Chargers. So while he may not be a high-risk start if he ends up clearing, he's still going to be medium. And as for like Michael Wilson, who scored last week, I don't know if I would be looking to try and utilize him if you need somebody to fill in because of a bye or an injury. Yo, Headliner Nation, I hope all of the analysis in this video was able to help you start setting your lineup for week 7. But don't forget to keep coming back throughout the rest of the week because as I mentioned, there's guys that we're still keeping an eye on and whether or not they're going to be ready for week 7. So hit that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and turn on the bell notifications. So anytime we drop new content, you can get caught up right away. Headliner Nation, stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.